Karen throws hot coffee at Barista for misspelling her name. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The morning rush at the popular coffee chain was in full swing, and the atmosphere inside the bustling cafe was thick with the sharp, comforting scent of freshly brewed espresso, the hum of milk frothing, and the quiet chatter of early risers seeking their daily caffeine fix. Baristas moved swiftly behind the counter, expertly pulling shots of espresso and expertly crafting lattes, cappuccinos, and mochas, all while navigating the crowded space filled with customers eager to get their orders and rush off to start their day. The morning light filtered through the large windows, casting a warm glow on the polished wooden tables and sleek countertops. But despite the apparent calm of the space, a storm was quietly brewing, and its epicenter was about to shift. Karen, a woman in her mid-30s, stood in line, her eyes scanning the menu board with an air of impatience that almost seemed to radiate off her. Her expensive sunglasses were perched atop her head, her perfectly manicured nails glimmering in the light, and her designer bag hung over her shoulder as if to remind everyone around her that she was someone to be reckoned with. Her expression was one of quiet disdain, as if she were already mentally judging the staff, sizing them up with a careful scrutiny that only someone of her apparent self-importance could muster. As she stepped forward to the counter, she quickly ordered her usual, a venti caramel latte with an extra shot of espresso, no whipped cream, and a splash of soy milk, ensuring that she added each specification with a tone that made it clear she expected the utmost precision. The barista, a young man in his early 20s with a friendly but tired smile, nodded politely and rang up the order. He seemed to be having a particularly busy morning, as the cafe had been packed since the doors had opened. He made a quick note of her order and moved on to prepare the drink, expertly grinding the beans and pulling the shot of espresso that would form the base of her latte. His movements were swift, honed by the repetition of 1,000 similar mornings, but as the minutes ticked by, Karen's irritation began to grow. She was waiting, tapping her fingers against the counter in sharp, impatient beats, her gaze flicking over the other customers as though they were all somehow slowing down the process. The quiet murmur of conversation around her only seemed to add to her agitation as she huffed and rolled her eyes every few seconds, clearly not amused by the delay. When the barista finally finished preparing her drink, he called out her name with the usual upbeat tone. "Karen, your latte is ready," he announced, handing the cup over with a smile, trying to remain cheerful despite the long line forming behind her. The moment Karen heard her name mispronounced, something snapped inside her. She froze, staring at the cup in disbelief, her eyes narrowing as they landed on the name scrawled across the lid in bold, block letters, Karen. The irritation that had been building up inside her since she walked into the cafe suddenly exploded. Her face flushed a deep crimson, and her perfectly painted lips curled into a sneer of utter contempt. She snatched the cup from the counter with far more force than necessary, causing the contents to slosh dangerously toward the edge. Her fingers trembled with barely contained rage as she glared at the barista, as if he had personally offended her in some unforgivable way. "Excuse me," she barked, her voice rising above the hum of the coffee shop. "You've got my name wrong. It's Karen, not Karen." Her tone was sharp, biting, as if she were addressing a child, as if the barista's mistake was the most egregious error imaginable. The young barista's smile faltered slightly as he looked back at her, trying to calm the situation down. "Oh, I'm so sorry about that, ma'am," he apologized immediately, his voice polite and apologetic. "It's just a small mix-up, I can remake it for you right away." But Karen, already inflamed, wasn't having it. She raised her hand, as if warding off the suggestion, and interrupted him. "No, no, no. This is exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. I come in here every morning, and every single time, you people still can't get my name right. It's Karen, not Karen, and this is just getting ridiculous." She was now speaking loudly enough that the other customers, who had been quietly sipping their coffee or conversing, couldn't help but turn their heads. The entire coffee shop had become silent, the gentle hum of activity coming to a screeching halt as everyone's attention shifted toward the commotion unfolding at the counter. The barista, clearly taken aback by her outburst, quickly regained his composure and offered a sincere apology. I'm really sorry about that, ma'am, he said, trying to keep his tone calm and professional. It's just a mistake. I'll remake your drink with the correct name right now, no problem. But Karen wasn't interested in hearing any more excuses. Her posture stiffened, and her voice grew even sharper. No. I don't want another drink. This is ridiculous. How hard is it to get a name right? It's not rocket science. How many times do I have to tell you? The anger in her voice was palpable, as though the mere idea of having her name misspelled was an affront to her very existence. The other baristas, sensing the growing tension, exchanged nervous glances. One of them began to quietly prepare another latte, but the situation was quickly spiraling out of control. Karen's tirade wasn't subsiding, it was escalating. She began pacing behind the counter, her face twisted in anger, her hands shaking as she gestured wildly with the coffee cup. You people always get it wrong. You don't respect me, you don't respect my time, and you certainly don't respect my name, she shouted, her voice growing louder and more frantic by the second. The barista, now visibly uncomfortable, offered another weak apology, his hands trembling slightly as he grabbed the remade latte and tried to hand it over. Here's your new drink, ma'am. I really hope this one's better. But Karen wasn't interested in the new drink. Instead, she looked at the cup with even more disdain, her eyes narrowing as she seethed. What kind of establishment are you running here? I'm a paying customer. I don't deserve this. I've come here every day, and every day you screw up my order. It's an embarrassment. She slammed the new cup onto the counter, nearly spilling the contents again. At this point, the other customers in the coffee shop began to take notice. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others whispered under their breath, uncertain whether to intervene or simply wait for the situation to de-escalate. A few brave souls shifted uncomfortably in their seats, watching with a mixture of pity and amusement, but no one moved to speak up. It was clear that Karen wasn't just upset about the misspelled name, this was about something deeper, something much more personal. The latte was simply the tipping point, the moment when everything she had been holding in came to the surface. For her, it was no longer just a mistake, it was a symbol of the disrespect she felt she had been dealing with for years, something she had decided she wouldn't tolerate any longer. The barista, a mere pawn in the larger drama unfolding before him, was about to learn just how far her temper could go. The tension in the coffee shop continued to rise as Karen's tirade became increasingly fervent, her words lashing out like a whip that had lost all control. As she shouted, the other customers awkwardly shifted in their seats, their eyes flickering between her and the barista, unsure of what to do, unsure of how to respond to this escalating situation. The barista, a young man who had been trying to remain calm, stood frozen for a moment, unsure of how to de-escalate the situation. He wasn't used to this, he had seen people grumble about their orders, maybe complain about a long wait, but this was something else. There was no simple apology that would calm Karen down. No polite offer to make things right would be enough to placate the storm that was now raging before him. In a desperate attempt to resolve the situation, the barista reached for the counter and pushed a small bowl of sugar packets toward Karen, a common gesture of offering something in exchange for appeasement. Ma'am, I'm really sorry for the mistake. If you'd like, we can get you another drink or anything else on the house. Please, I just want to make this right. His voice was still gentle, but there was a hint of uncertainty, the kind of uncertainty that comes from dealing with an angry customer who refuses to accept reason. He was waiting for the storm to pass, hoping that maybe his offer, no matter how small, would calm her down. But Karen wasn't having it. She grabbed the bowl of sugar packets and shoved it off the counter with such force that it skittered across the floor, spilling its contents in all directions. This isn't about sugar or some free drink, she screamed, her voice echoing through the small cafe. It's about respect. It's about the fact that every time I come in here, I get treated like I don't matter. It's about the fact that you people can't even spell my name right. She was no longer just speaking to the barista. Her words were directed at everyone within earshot, as if she wanted the entire world to hear her frustration, to share in her anger. A few customers began to glance nervously at the exit, as if considering the idea of leaving before things went even further south. One of them, a man in a suit, adjusted his tie and gave an awkward smile to his companion, as if trying to pretend that this scene wasn't unfolding right before them. Another customer, a young woman sitting near the counter, pulled out her phone, her eyes shifting between Karen and the barista, the telltale signs of someone preparing to record the chaos for the internet. The energy in the room was shifting now, not just one of discomfort, but of curiosity. People were starting to realize they were witnessing something that was going to become a spectacle. Karen's face reddened with each passing second, her rage growing with every breath. She continued her tirade, now louder, sharper, as if her anger had reached a boiling point. This place is a joke. How hard is it to get a name right? You know what? I come here every morning, and this is what I get in return. This is how I'm treated. I'm tired of it. I'm tired of being treated like I don't matter. Her voice cracked with emotion, as though her frustration had finally overwhelmed her ability to maintain composure. The barista, realizing that no apology was going to fix the situation, glanced behind him at the other employees, silently signaling for backup. A woman, a manager by the looks of her attire, walked over from the back, her face already strained from hearing the commotion. She was used to managing situations like these. Dealing with difficult customers was part of the job. But Karen was different. She wasn't just upset about a coffee order, she was trying to start a war, turning an innocent mistake into a personal crusade. The manager approached Karen cautiously, keeping a calm but firm expression. "Ma'am, I can see that you're upset, and I sincerely apologize for the mix-up with your name. We'd be more than happy to remake your drink and correct any issues with the order. I understand how frustrating this must be." She said it with a practiced, empathetic tone, but Karen was already too far gone to be reasoned with. "No. No more drinks," Karen shouted, cutting the manager off mid-sentence. "You think I care about your pathetic little drink? You think I'm going to sit here and let you make another cup just to screw it up again? No, I'm done with this place. Done." She was trembling now, her hands gripping the edge of the counter with white knuckles as her body shook with anger. It was as if the coffee cup, her latte, had become the final straw, the symbol of every tiny slight she had ever experienced in her life. It was never just about the coffee anymore. It was about how she saw herself treated in the world. The barista and the manager exchanged a glance, but Karen didn't notice. The entire cafe was silent now, with the exception of her continued shouting. The young barista stood frozen behind the counter, unsure of what his next move should be. The manager, now facing the reality of just how volatile the situation had become, motioned for the other staff to step back. "We'll take care of everything, ma'am," the manager said, her voice now tinged with a touch of frustration, though she tried to keep her tone as neutral as possible. She wasn't used to customers behaving this way, not over something as simple as a name mix-up. But it didn't matter. Karen wasn't listening anymore. She was so far beyond reason that nothing short of a drastic intervention would stop her. Her eyes widened with a new, dangerous energy, and the words she shouted next would change everything. "You think I'm going to let this go?" Karen yelled, her voice hoarse and strained. "You're all a bunch of incompetents. You think you can just push me around and treat me like this? I'm not some nobody. I'm a paying customer, and I demand respect." With those words, Karen's anger reached its peak. In one swift motion, she ripped the lid off her cup, spilling a little of the steaming coffee across the counter. The barista flinched at the sudden movement, stepping back as Karen raised the cup in the air, her face contorted with fury. "This is what you deserve," she screamed, and in a shocking, reckless move, she hurled the hot liquid directly across the counter at the barista. The coffee splashed against the barista's apron and arm, a burning, scalding wave that sent a sharp, painful jolt through him. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The entire coffee shop held its breath, watching in stunned silence as the barista recoiled from the force of the coffee strike. The manager stepped forward instinctively, trying to protect her employee, but Karen wasn't finished. "This is what you get for treating people like garbage," Karen shouted, her face twisted in a combination of rage and satisfaction, as if her actions had somehow validated her anger. The barista, clearly shaken and in pain, clutched his arm as the burn from the coffee began to sting and redden. He staggered back, instinctively raising his hand to his face as the hot liquid soaked through his shirt. The manager, now fully aware of the severity of the situation, stepped in, pulling Karen back and ordering her to leave. But Karen was not listening. She was still yelling, her voice rising in a frantic crescendo, as if she were trying to make the whole world hear her anguish. "I'm done with this place. You'll regret treating me like this. I'll have your jobs for this, do you hear me?" Karen screamed, her voice now a raw shriek that echoed in the small cafe. The room felt suffocating, as though the very air had been thickened by her anger, and the room stood still, caught in the madness of the moment. The atmosphere inside the coffee shop had shifted from uncomfortable to downright toxic. The sudden eruption of Karen's anger, coupled with the now visibly shaken barista, left the space charged with tension, the sound of her screaming echoing off the walls like a jagged echo bouncing around the small space. The young man, still trying to regain his composure, stood at the counter, clutching his burned arm with his other hand. The pain was starting to set in, but it was the shock of what had just happened that left him frozen in place. He had expected maybe a harsh word, an uncomfortable confrontation, but not this. Not hot coffee being thrown across the counter. It was almost surreal in its violence, like something out of a nightmare. Meanwhile, Karen was still ranting, her words now less coherent, her rage escalating with each breath. Her face was twisted in anger, her eyes wide and unblinking, as though the very injustice she felt had blinded her to everything else. "You're all worthless," she screamed, her voice rising even higher. "Do you even know who I am? I am Karen." She threw her hands up in the air, as if the sheer force of her self-importance could make everything bend to her will. "I shouldn't have to deal with this kind of treatment. You should all be ashamed of yourselves." Her words were growing more and more disconnected from reality, her sense of entitlement amplified by every passing second. The other customers, who had been standing in stunned silence for the past few minutes, were now beginning to stir. The silence had been broken by Karen's tirade, but they were still unsure of what to do. Some had pulled out their phones, no doubt eager to record the entire ordeal, capturing every moment of Karen's meltdown for the world to see. Others simply watched, perhaps with a mix of fear and fascination, unsure whether to intervene or to just remain passive observers in the increasingly absurd spectacle. No one, it seemed, was willing to stand up and say something. It was as if they were all frozen, caught between the shock of what was happening and the awkwardness of not wanting to get involved. In the midst of this chaos, the manager, a woman with short, auburn hair and a professional demeanor, stepped forward. Her face was grim, her brow furrowed in concern as she approached Karen, but her voice remained calm and even, trying to counterbalance the tension. "Ma'am, I need you to leave. Now." She spoke with authority, her words firm but not aggressive, though Karen wasn't listening. "You've caused a disturbance, and we can't allow that to continue." The manager's attempt at maintaining control was met with a wave of disbelief and more shouting from Karen, who was clearly far from being ready to back down. "You think you can just throw me out like that?" Karen sneered, her voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can just sweep this under the rug like I'm some nobody?" Her body was trembling now, not just with anger, but with the kind of energy that comes from a person who has completely lost control of the situation. "You can't just erase me. I'll make sure you regret this. I'll make sure you never treat anyone like this again." Her words had become increasingly desperate, almost frantic, as if she were trying to make herself feel powerful again after the small slip-up of the barista. She was spiraling, and it was becoming more apparent that this moment, however trivial it seemed on the surface, was about something much deeper, something that had nothing to do with a mere cup of coffee. The barista, still clutching his arm, winced as the burn from the coffee grew worse. It was clear now that he had been hit with a decent amount of scalding liquid, and the redness was starting to spread across his skin. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to focus, to push through the sting that was now radiating across his arm. But his mind wasn't on the pain. It was on Karen, and the ridiculousness of the situation. He had made a simple mistake. A mistake, mind you, that was so common in his line of work that it barely registered on most customers' radars. But Karen, she wasn't like most customers. She didn't see the world in the same way. For her, this mistake wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a personal attack. It was an offense that had shaken her perception of herself and her place in the world. The sheer magnitude of her response made no sense, but it was undeniable. The manager glanced over at the barista, then back at Karen, who was still in full-blown meltdown mode, her voice reaching a near shriek as she continued to lash out. "If you don't leave now, I'll have to call the police," the manager said, her patience finally beginning to wear thin. It was a last resort, but she could see that there was no talking Karen down anymore. She wasn't interested in reason. She wasn't interested in apologies or solutions. She was angry, and that anger had consumed her entirely. Karen didn't hesitate. The moment the manager mentioned the police, she exploded. "Call them! Call them!" she shouted, her voice now raw from the relentless screaming. "I don't care. I'll have you all fired. You'll see." Her hands were flailing wildly as she gestured toward the counter, toward the barista, as though he were the one personally responsible for every wrong that had ever been done to her. "This is your fault," she yelled at the barista, as if somehow his slip-up with her name had set off a chain of events that had led her to this point of madness. "You should have known better. You should have spelled it right. But no, you just don't care. No one cares about me." The manager, now visibly frustrated, turned her attention to the barista, signaling for him to retreat from the counter. It was clear that Karen wasn't going to stop, and the situation was only going to escalate if the barista remained in her line of fire. As the barista moved away from the counter, his eyes met the manager's. There was an unspoken understanding between them, the kind that comes from having been in the service industry long enough to know when a situation has gone beyond the point of no return. The other baristas, who had been standing back, looking on in stunned silence, now began to act. One of them reached for the phone, preparing to call security or the police, but Karen noticed. Her eyes snapped to the phone, and her already ragged voice rose to a new level of fury. "You're all just trying to get me arrested now, aren't you? Is that it? You think I'm some criminal? I'll have you know I have rights. You can't treat me like this." Her face was red with exertion, her chest heaving as she took in gulps of air, but it wasn't enough. She was consumed by a kind of madness, the belief that she had been wronged so profoundly that every ounce of her being had to fight back against it. In her mind, there was no such thing as compromise. There was only her version of the world, where she was always right, and everyone else was always at fault. And in that moment, it was clear, Karen wasn't just fighting for the right to have her name spelled correctly on a coffee cup. No, she was fighting for something much bigger in her mind, the right to control how she was treated, the right to demand that the world bend to her will. She wasn't just a customer in this coffee shop, she was the center of the universe, and everyone else was merely an obstacle in her path. The situation inside the coffee shop had reached a boiling point, and it was clear that Karen was no longer just a customer, she had become a full-blown spectacle, a force of chaos that no one could contain. The manager, her face now a mask of professional restraint, made one final attempt to regain control of the situation, her voice now firmer, laced with the frustration that had been building in her for the past several minutes. "Ma'am, I've asked you multiple times to leave the premises. If you do not comply, I will be forced to call the police. This behavior is unacceptable, and I will not tolerate it any longer." Her tone was final, as though she were trying to bring the curtain down on this absurd scene once and for all, but Karen was beyond listening. "No. No, you won't." Karen shot back, her voice rising in pitch and volume, as if each word were a demand she had every right to make. "You'll never get away with this. I have rights. I'm going to make sure everyone knows how terrible you are. You'll see." Karen was hysterical now, her body trembling with fury, her face flushed a deep red as she took a step forward, as though daring the manager or anyone else to try to stop her. The manager, not willing to let things escalate further, took a cautious step back, her hands up in a defensive gesture, signaling for the other baristas to remain at a safe distance. They were all watching now, unsure of what would happen next. The barista, whose arm had been burned by the scalding coffee, stood back, his face pale and tense as he watched the unfolding chaos with a mixture of disbelief and discomfort. The customers who had been standing in stunned silence were now more vocal, some of them murmuring under their breath, exchanging glances, while others, still holding their phones, recorded the scene, capturing every dramatic moment for the world to see. In that instant, the coffee shop was no longer just a place where people grabbed their morning coffee. It had become a stage, a reality show for the bystanders, and an absolute nightmare for the employees. It was as if time had slowed down, each second dragging on in agonizing detail as Karen's outburst raged on. The sound of her voice filled the air, sharp and unnerving, while the awkward, hesitant silence from the rest of the shop felt like a counterpoint to her fury. And then, without warning, the tension in the air seemed to snap like a brittle wire under too much strain. The door opened, and in walked a police officer, his uniform crisp, his face unreadable, but his presence immediately commanded the space. The moment he stepped inside, the noise from Karen's rant seemed to subside, if only slightly, and for a brief moment, the whole shop held its collective breath, waiting to see how the situation would unfold. The officer surveyed the scene quickly, his gaze shifting from Karen to the manager, then to the barista, taking in the details of the situation before approaching the counter with a calm but firm demeanor. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises," the officer said, his voice steady and authoritative, though not unfriendly. "You've caused a disturbance, and your behavior is no longer acceptable." Karen, clearly not expecting the arrival of law enforcement, froze for a moment. Her wide eyes locked onto the officer's face, and for the briefest of seconds, it seemed as though a flicker of realization passed through her. She wasn't going to win this. She wasn't going to have the last word. The officer wasn't going to bend to her will. But that flicker of realization quickly turned back into defiance, and she puffed out her chest, glaring at him as if he were yet another adversary in her ongoing battle against the world. "You can't do this. You can't just throw me out like this. I'm a paying customer," she screamed, her voice cracking as she pointed a finger at the officer, her words a desperate attempt to cling to whatever semblance of control she thought she had left. The officer didn't flinch. He had dealt with situations like this before, people who thought they were above the rules, people who refused to acknowledge that they had crossed the line. "Ma'am, I'm asking you to leave now. If you don't, you're going to be placed under arrest for trespassing and disturbing the peace," he said, his tone unwavering. Karen's face contorted in rage, her nostrils flaring as she seethed, but there was something else in her eyes now, fear. The kind of fear that comes when someone realizes they've gone too far, that their tantrum has reached a point of no return. She was no longer the person in control of the situation. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Karen was faced with the reality that there were consequences to her actions. The officer was not going to be intimidated. The manager was not going to back down. And the barista, despite the burn on his arm, was not going to be her punching bag any longer. For a moment, Karen just stood there, her chest heaving, the words bubbling up from deep within her throat, but no sound came out. It was as if the sheer weight of the situation had finally broken through her mental barricade. She was losing. The thought seemed to settle over her, and for the first time, she was unsure of what to do next. Her hands trembled at her sides as the officer moved closer, his hand now resting on the cuffs at his belt, signaling that he was ready to take action if she didn't comply. "Last chance, ma'am," the officer said, his voice still steady, still professional. "If you don't leave now, I will have to place you under arrest." And then, as if in one final, futile act of defiance, Karen took a step back, her face flushed with rage, her hands still trembling. "You'll regret this," she spat, her voice barely audible as she turned on her heel and stormed out of the coffee shop, slamming the door behind her with a force that shook the walls. The cafe was silent for a moment, the tension still lingering in the air, before the officer turned to the manager and offered a nod of acknowledgement. "Is everyone okay?" he asked, his tone softer now, as if the tension had been broken, though the damage had already been done. The manager, still a little shaken, nodded gratefully. "We're fine." "Thank you for handling that," she replied, her voice a little hoarse, though relieved. The officer smiled, the moment of tension dissipating as quickly as it had arrived. "No problem. Just doing my job." He looked at the barista, who was still holding his arm, the burn now a throbbing reminder of the chaos that had just unfolded. "You're going to be all right?" he asked. The barista nodded slowly, his face pale but resolute. "Yeah, I'll be fine. Just not how I thought my shift would go today." The officer chuckled lightly and patted him on the shoulder. "That's the service industry for you." With a final glance at the scene around him, he turned and walked out, leaving the cafe to return to its regular rhythm, though it would never quite be the same after that. The customers who had witnessed the chaos slowly returned to their conversations, some with uneasy glances toward the door, others pulling out their phones to check the viral videos that were already making the rounds. But the barista and the manager shared a quiet understanding, one that would forever tie them to the strange, surreal spectacle that had unfolded in their coffee shop, and they both knew that it would be a long time before the echoes of that day truly faded. The door closed behind the officer, and the cafe fell back into its usual hum, the noise of the espresso machine, the chatter of the customers, and the clinking of cups slowly filling the air once again. But for those who had witnessed Karen's meltdown, nothing about that day would ever be quite as simple as a cup of coffee again.